It was an ordinary Monday morning, and Susan was confronted with a big problem. Her usual babysitter was sick, and her daughter Sophie was still too young for kindergarten. She worked as an accountant in a big company and was afraid she would lose her job if she didn't show up for work. She called her colleague, a mother, and asked her for help, but her colleague was everything but understanding. "You are bringing Sophie to the office?" she said sourly. "That's just going to interfere with business." When they arrived at the store, Susan was met by her colleague Emily, who was visibly unhappy. "Is the kid sick?" asked Emily unkindly as she looked at Sophie. "I want to go skiing next week while on vacation, and I don't want her to contaminate me." Susan was naturally hurt by her colleague's reaction and tried to explain that she had no choice. But Emily was unwilling to listen and ignored her all day. Susan was worried about how Sophie would spend the day in her office, so she brought her a coloring book and some pencils to keep her busy. She sat Sophie down at a table in a quiet corner of the office and gave her a coloring book with pencils. Sophie immediately began coloring, and Susan breathed a sigh of relief. Susan then focused on her work and tried to ignore her colleague's adverse reaction. Instead, she completed her task quickly and efficiently, ensuring Sophie was busy and happy. Sophie spent the day calmly and quietly at her desk, coloring in her coloring book. She was afraid of disturbing her mother's colleagues and wanted to ensure she did not interfere with her work. But despite Sophie's calm demeanor, Susan's colleague was still unfriendly. As the day progressed, Sophie became thirsty and wanted to get something to drink. She didn't want to disturb her mother as she was absorbed in her work. So Sophie decided to go to the tea kitchen by herself and get a glass of water. When she arrived at the tea kitchen, she looked for a clean glass. She opened the cupboard and took out a glass. Unfortunately, the glass was not clean, and Sophie was about to put it in the sink when it slipped out of her hand and smashed on the floor. At that moment, just as Sophie was cleaning everything up, Emily, Susan's work colleague, came into the room. She saw the broken glass and immediately scolded Sophie. "Look at what you've done," she said. "Now we have to clean all this up, and I don't have time to do it." Sophie was frightened and didn't know what to say. At that moment, Susan came into the tea room and saw that Emily scolded Sophie. She became angry with Emily for her rude way of treating her daughter. She explained to her that Sophie had accidentally broken the glass and she would clean it up. Emily did not apologize but blamed Susan for bringing her daughter to work. Susan was upset with Emily's behavior and decided it was enough. She reached out to her boss and asked to speak with him. She explained the situation to him and asked for his help. The boss listened carefully to Susan and realized that her concerns were valid. So he called Emily into the office and spoke with her about her behavior. He explained to her that Sophie's presence did not interfere with work and that Sophie was welcome. Emily apologized to Susan and Sophie and promised to change her behavior. Things went quiet for the rest of the workday, and Susan could finally concentrate on her work without worrying about Sophie. Sophie continued to color in her coloring book and occasionally chatted with the other staff members who were curious about her. She told them about her favorite things and what she liked to do, and the staff told her about their hobbies and interests. Sophie found it interesting to hear what the adults were up to, and she was happy to have someone to talk to. When the workday was over, Susan took Sophie to see her boss. She wanted to thank him for his help during the day and be sure there would be no more problems. When the boss saw Sophie, he was stunned for a moment. Then his eyes widened, and he stared at Sophie as if he recognized her. Susan noticed his reaction and wondered what it meant. However, she did not ask him any further, thinking it would be inappropriate. Instead, she thanked him for his support and assured him that she and Sophie would not cause any problems in the future. The boss nodded and smiled, but Susan still saw confusion in his eyes. Finally, she left the office with Sophie and headed home. On the way home, Susan was still thinking about her boss's reaction, but she decided it was probably nothing and not to worry. Susan and Sophie returned to their tiny apartment where they lived alone. Susan had been a single parent since the death of her husband and had adjusted to raising her daughter alone. They had adopted Sophie because she couldn't have children of her own, but she had always wanted a family. She had fallen in love with Sophie when she first saw her and knew she would be a perfect mother. Once home, Susan prepared dinner while Sophie flipped through her coloring books and showed off her new paintings. They chatted about the day, and Sophie talked about the exciting things she'd seen at the office. Susan listened attentively and was relieved that Sophie had enjoyed the day despite everything. They ate together, and afterwards Susan read Sophie a bedtime story before bed. Susan kissed Sophie on the forehead and wished Sophie good night before going to sleep. As Susan lay in bed trying to fall asleep, she couldn't stop thinking about her boss's reaction toward Sophie. At that moment, the phone rang. Susan straightened up and reached for the receiver, worried about who would be calling at this hour. It was her boss. He apologized for calling her at this late hour. The boss sounded very concerned, and Susan could hear the stress in his voice. He told her he had something important to say, but wouldn't tell her what it was about. Instead, he requested that they meet in the office and assured her everything was all right. Susan was concerned and confused about the cryptic nature of the call. She wondered if there might be some problem with Sophie. However, she decided to stop thinking about it and prepared for their meeting. Susan tried to stay calm but couldn't shake the fear that something terrible would happen. She was afraid there would be trouble. The night passed, and Susan had a troubled sleep, constantly thinking about her boss's reaction. She had strange dreams in which she was fired or something terrible happened to Sophie. She woke up several times sweating and scared. She was terrified about the meeting with her boss and wondered what he would say to her. She couldn't stop worrying and had difficulty going back to sleep. When morning came, she felt tired and tense. She got Sophie ready for the babysitter and then went to work. She couldn't stop thinking about the upcoming meeting with her boss and was afraid of what he would say to her. Susan went to work with an uneasy feeling and met with her boss there. The boss looked visibly confused, and Susan wondered what was going on. The boss asked Susan to have a seat and began to talk. He explained that he needed to speak to her about something very important. Susan's heart began to race, and she wondered what the boss was so worried about. The boss retrieved a folder from a hidden place on his desk. He placed it on the table before Susan and said, "I have something to show you that I hid a long time ago. It's important, and I think it will explain everything." Sophie's adoption papers were in the folder, and the boss revealed that he was Sophie's biological father. Susan was shocked and couldn't believe it. She looked at the boss and wondered how this could be possible. The boss explained that he had a relationship many years ago and that Sophie resulted from that relationship. He said Sophie's mother died in childbirth, and he was forced to give Sophie up for adoption because he was overwhelmed with the loss of his woman and Sophie. He said he had always been there for Sophie and was willing to accept her as his daughter. Susan was confused and had difficulty processing all of this. She wondered how this would change her life and Sophie's. How do you think Susan should have reacted to her boss's revelation? What would you have done in her place? What will the relationship between Susan, Sophie, and the boss be like in the future? Do you think they can become a family? Or will there always be an awkward tension between them? Feel free to write us your opinion about it in the comments.